Say this sentence out loud. Je voudrais aller au cinéma. Pronounce every sound correctly. Every vowel exactly where it belongs. Now say it again. This time, stress each word the way you would in English. Give each one its own weight, its own little peak. Je voudrais aller au cinéma. 5 separate flags, planted in a row. Same words, same sounds, same grammar. And yet only one of those 2 versions sounds French. That should bother you a little. We're taught that an accent lives in the sounds, the U, the R, the nasal vowels. But you just heard proof that an accent can survive perfect sounds, completely intact. So if it's not the sounds, what is it? Keep that question in mind. We're going to spend the next few minutes answering it properly. And the answer goes somewhere you probably don't expect. Into French poetry, into a 19th century classroom, and into the question of what correct French even means. When people talk about pronunciation, they almost always mean phonetics, the individual sounds of a language. Can you produce the French R? Can you make a nasal vowel without an English N creeping onto the end of it? These skills matter. They're necessary. But they're only one layer of pronunciation. The second layer is called prosody, the musical architecture of speech. Rhythm, intonation, timing, accentuation, the pauses, the way words gather into larger units instead of standing alone. Think of a musician who plays every note correctly, but places the emphasis in the wrong spots and ignores the underlying rhythm. Technically, every note is right, and the music still sounds wrong. The same thing happens in a language. You can pronounce every word correctly and still pronounce the sentence incorrectly. Because an accent doesn't only live inside vowels and consonants, it lives in how the sentence is organized. Most learners approach French one word at a time. Learn a word, learn its pronunciation, place it beside the next word and the next. But natural French speech isn't a sequence of independent dictionary entries. It's organized into groups. English leans heavily on stress within individual words. Some syllables become strongly prominent, others fade. French works differently. Its rhythm organizes around larger groups of words, with the strongest prominence generally landing near the end of the group. The smaller words lose their independence. They lean into their neighbors. The sentence moves forward as one unit, not 5. This is why a learner can sound hesitant, even with flawless grammar. It's rarely the sounds that give them away. It's that they're dividing the sentence in the wrong places, announcing every word instead of letting them travel together. This becomes visible with liaison and elision, and this is usually where courses lose people, because liaison gets taught as a list. Sometimes mandatory, sometimes optional, sometimes forbidden. The impression it leaves is that liaison is an extra sound, inserted artificially between 2 otherwise complete words. That's not quite how connected speech works. Take les amis. On the page, 2 separate words. In speech, the final consonant of les migrates onto the front of the next syllable. Les amis. The written boundary and the spoken boundary simply aren't in the same place. Elision does something similar. We write j'aime, but French won't tolerate 2 vowels colliding like that. The first one disappears. J'aime. In both cases, the language isn't behaving as a chain of sealed, independent words. It's reorganizing itself into one continuous spoken movement. For a learner, this looks like a rule to memorize. For a native speaker, it simply feels like the natural shape of the phrase. Which raises a real question. How does a rule turn into a feeling? One likely answer is repeated exposure to rhythm, and historically, One of the most powerful sources of that exposure in France was poetry. Prose lets you move quickly and focus almost entirely on meaning. You can read a sentence without ever consciously counting its syllables. Poetry won't let you do that. It slows the language down and forces you to listen to its form. Classical French poetry built itself around strict, structured meter. The most famous is the alexandrine, 12 syllables, split into two six-syllable halves around a central pause, the césure. And that pause isn't decorative. 6 syllables is roughly one natural human breath group. The alexandrine borrowed the rhythm of breathing itself and gave it a fixed, repeatable shape. But you can't count those 12 syllables just by looking at the written vowels. To know whether a line works, you have to understand how French actually behaves in speech. Does this unstressed E count or disappear before the next vowel? Do these two sounds stay separate or flow together? Where does the line pause? And where does the rhythm carry on despite the punctuation? A syllable stops being an abstract rule in a textbook. It either fits the line or it doesn't. That's what makes poetry a kind of prosodic laboratory. It makes the architecture of speech, timing, grouping, elision, flow, impossible to ignore. Here's an important distinction, and it matters for keeping this whole argument honest. A classical poem is not a recording of casual conversation. Poetic meter follows its own conventions. Some sounds get pronounced in a formal recitation that would quietly vanish in a cafe conversation. A liaison that sounds natural in a poem can sound overly elevated if you used it ordering a coffee. Traditional poetic delivery is slower, more deliberate, more dramatic than spontaneous speech. So the claim isn't, recite an alexandrine and you'll sound like a native speaker tomorrow. That would be misleading, and it would undersell what's actually going on. A musician doesn't practice scales because real music is made only of scales. Scales isolate a pattern so the musician can hear it, absorb it, and later use it freely without thinking about it. Poetry does something similar for language. It exaggerates and organizes certain processes that already exist inside French. So a learner has a controlled place to observe them before recognizing them everywhere else. For generations, literary recitation held a real place in French education. But the history needs to be told precisely, not romantically. Before mass schooling, extensive literary training belonged mostly to educated, privileged groups. What actually happened is more specific and more recent. In 1882, under Jules Ferry, France restructured its primary school system, and poetry recitation entered the official curriculum for every child, not just the privileged ones. For the first time, memorizing and reciting verse became a normal part of a national working-class education. And this wasn't simply literary appreciation. Historical teaching accounts describe teachers reading a passage slowly, marking every pause, making the whole class repeat it together, correcting articulation. In some documented cases, working to soften a child's regional accent. Read that list again. Pauses, repetition, articulation, accent correction. That's not a literature lesson. That's vocal training. France ran a nationwide pronunciation curriculum through poetry, a full century before anyone would have called it that. And here is where this stops being only a language story. France has never spoken with a single voice. For most of its history, people spoke regional languages, dialects, and varieties of French that differed considerably from what was promoted in Paris and in national institutions. So when a school corrected a child's pronunciation, it wasn't a neutral act. It was promoting one particular model of French, a model tied to education, national unity, social mobility, and cultural legitimacy. Literary recitation transmitted canonical texts, La Fontaine, Hugo, Racine, Corneille. But alongside the texts, it transmitted a canonical voice, where to pause, what to emphasize, how to control a voice, how to stand in front of others and speak with authority. Recitation trained memory and literary taste. But it also trained the body, the breath, the mouth, the posture, the public voice. Which means poetry was doing something larger than teaching pronunciation. It was helping build a shared national culture and drawing a line between speech considered refined and speech considered regional, popular, or simply incorrect. The school didn't just reflect the sound of standard French, it helped produce it. Picture that process repeated across an entire schooling. Hear the teacher read. Follow the phrasing. Repeat it as a class. Memorize the sound sequence. Recite it from memory. Get corrected on articulation and rhythm. Then do it again, with the next text and the next. Over years, that can train far more than literary memory. Sensitivity to syllables, to breath groups, to the length of a phrase, to how syntax and intonation relate, to where vowels quietly disappear, to where words connect, to where a voice naturally rises, settles, or pauses. It's worth staying careful here, because overclaiming would undercut the whole argument. There's no clean historical experiment proving that poetry recitation alone created the prosody of modern spoken French. Family, region, social environment, everyday conversation, all of it shapes pronunciation too. But two things are well established, separately. Historical records show recitation was deliberately used to train articulation, diction, and vocal delivery. And modern linguistics shows that rhythm and prosody strongly influence whether speech is perceived as native or foreign. The connection between those two facts isn't a stretch. For generations, poetry offered repeated, embodied practice in exactly the skill that turns out to matter most. Modern language tools are extremely good at breaking language into small pieces: a word, a sound, a grammar rule, a multiple-choice question, a 10-second clip. That makes language easy to analyze. It also strips out continuity. A learner can become excellent at recognizing individual pieces without ever developing a feel for the whole. Poetry asks for the opposite. It keeps you inside a phrase from beginning to end. It makes you anticipate where it's going. It asks you to remember not just what the words mean, but how they move through time. And once a poem is memorized, your attention is freed from decoding text. You can actually listen to the voice itself, the breath, the duration, the connections, the balance, the repetition. That may be one of poetry's most underrated gifts to a learner. It temporarily removes the burden of building every sentence from zero. The language is already there. Your job is just to inhabit it. So, concretely, how do you use this, starting today, without sounding like a 19th century stage actor? Not by picking a difficult poem, reading it dramatically once, and hoping something changes. Start by listening before you read. Let a native reading meet your ear before your eyes start complicating it with spelling. Notice where the reader speeds up, where the voice pauses, which words seem to belong together, where the phrase seems to land. Then read the text and mark the groups you actually heard, not where the words end on the page, but where the phrase breathes. Notice the elisions, notice the liaisons. Then imitate one single line, not the whole poem, one line. Record yourself. Compare it to the original, listening for duration and grouping, not just vowels and consonants. Then memorize that line completely, so your attention is free for flow instead of decoding. And finally, carry that same awareness into prose, into conversation. The goal was never to sound like an actor reciting Racine. The goal is an ear that can hear French as continuous, rhythmically organized speech, instead of a row of separate words. Phonetics can teach you how a French sound is made. It was never going to teach you how French moves. For generations, French schools understood that gap and closed it with memorized poetry, one recited line at a time, in classrooms across the entire country. Not only to produce readers of literature, to produce a shared national voice and a shared idea of what correct French was supposed to sound like. That history won't hand you a perfect accent. Nothing will. But go back to the sentence you said out loud at the very start. Je voudrais aller au cinéma. You now know exactly why one version sounded French and the other didn't. And you know the language has been teaching that difference to its own speakers, on purpose, for well over a century. Poetry doesn't just teach you more French, it gives you a different ear.